Teresa. I'm part of the Gender and Empowerment team, and a lot of the questions that we are thinking about or looking at now are sort of the intergenerational links between and within households. So in the case of the questions that you had here around the differential benefits to women and girls, I was curious if your exploration of that question included looking at the impact of the activities with women on girls and vice versa, because I know that some of your interventions are through schools that directly impact girls, and I know some of the others are more directly intervening at the adult level. And so I was just curious to see if you guys came across any information around that, or if that was something that you guys are also interested in learning more about.
Helen, do you want to take a stab at that?
I think it's a fascinating question. You know, we know that a lot of the impact is on one generation affects the other. So we've got evidence of, or there's anecdotal stories around when women get released from some activities, it can get passed on to the next generation and so on. I don't think we've been able to compare on this statistic, on the data that we have so far, what the effects of lightening the burden is. And it's quite interesting in that there's in the water work, unlike some of the other activities of care, it's primarily a burden reducing initiative. It's not at least the water and sanitation, water for domestic use and sanitation work doesn't involve very much more work for people, except for those involved in the committee. For most people, it actually reduces time, and that's beneficial to both generations. You know, whereas involvement in groups or in economic activities, often the burden then falls on the girls. So, you know, I think it's a very interesting area, and would be really interested offline, you know, to talk about how we could work, you know, what you're doing and how we could work more on it.
Could I ask a quick follow-up question around the burden reduction? Because it was one of the questions that I was thinking about when we were flipping through some of those slides. And I was curious, is the burden reducing mostly because of the technologies and the access being better, more facilitated for women and girls, or are there also aspects of it where men are also picking up some of the burden? I saw in the Rwanda example where men and boys were engaged, and I guess related to that is the burden that's related to water collection perhaps is decreased. I'm just curious if any of the questions looked at sort of the broader workload burdens that women and girls carry, and if they picked up other pieces of work because they had more time, or if in fact their leisure time actually did go up, which I saw that you guys had in one of your tools. I'm sorry, that was a very multifaceted question, but I was just really curious about that one piece also.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Go ahead, Helen.
So I think my sense from the research so far is that the first and obvious benefits are the bringing water closer and cleaner. So cleaner means health benefits, means less need to look after ill children, etc. The issue of men taking on responsibilities is very, very limited. So there's some examples where the project has actively taken on a traditional role reversal type element that involved men in saying, look, this is new technology, it's got a pump and it's got a pipe and so on, and therefore you can collect as well, it doesn't have to be women. There's also a few really interesting examples of where things like masons or mechanics that have been recruited or trained by CARE have been women and not men. Quite a few examples of that, and that's started to change some perceptions of men and women's roles. And then involving women on the leadership position also allows for opportunities for change. But I think, and correct me, Malika, if you feel differently, but my sense is that with what's traditionally be seen as a technical sector, the changes that have come about have been more because of technical changes than because of our understanding of the opportunities for social changes in terms of gender dynamics. And if we put both of them together, we'd have so much more influence. And really, that's the direction of change. That's what we'd like to do.
I completely agree. It has been primarily technological as far as what's driving changes in women's time, and we haven't really questioned the status quo. When we talk to communities and they say, oh, this is so much better now, we don't have to spend as much time collecting water. We don't. A lot of times, the root of that was part technology, but part the fact that women, on top of all their other activities, had to, bear the brunt of the water collection responsibilities, and it can be quite unfair, as we know. But for us to then go into, well, why is it that on top of all the other responsibilities, women are the sole bearers of that particular burden, and there's no attempt to relieve that pressure by husbands or we haven't touched that, except like in the research that Helen presented on the upcoming research in the Wawash project in West Africa. For example, one of the quantitative tools, looks at roles and responsibilities and asks questions around, ask both men and women separately, what do you feel are, women's roles as far as collecting water for domestic purposes? What are women's roles as far as using water for productive purposes? And vice versa for men. What are both men's and women's roles? So I think that's the first step, that's the next step for us, trying to understand those perceptions and how flexible or inflexible they are, and what the entry points might be to start having those discussions about equity and division of labor and responsibility that we can then start to, build on in programming when we better understand the extent to which those attitudes, what those attitudes are like, and how they could possibly be influenced.
So Dar has a question. He asked, have men been engaged in this process at any stage? And I know, Helen, you kind of touched on that a bit, but is there anything else either one of you would add to that in terms of men's engagement at any stages?
I can't think of much new other than that. I think it's symptomatic of the same issue that we haven't really touched on. We haven't really sort of taken aside men and women and tried to examine, men's attitudes as much, or women's attitude. We maybe have talked more with women from the standpoint of just, we've done more outreach and have tried to get them engaged in things like joining water user committees or, the savings groups as mentioned earlier, but I can't think of ways in which we've, in the past, historically engaged men as much in trying to determine their attitudes or getting them involved in things that were not infrastructure related, like, water points, construction or sanitation construction. I don't know if I can think of anything, Helen, other than sort of the more infrastructure-focused type of work.
If the question is, to what extent have we involved men in using this entry point to change gender dynamics, I think the answer is generally not explicitly, but almost everywhere it does actually lead to some changes, because it's a safe area for to allow a discussion about women being involved in committees, for example. That's probably the area there's been the most discussion, is around women's voice in issues that actually often affect them more, but where public space and leadership is not supposed to be held by women. So, in thousands of communities, there's been this discussion with NGOs bringing in, working with government, but often leading the idea that these committees should involve some women, up to that at least 50% of them should be women. And that provides the opportunity for discussions around why and will they be any good. And then often when they've been involved, and initially there's a lot of skepticism about it, but then second time round there's a lot less skepticism because people realize that they can do it, and actually it makes sense and it works very well. There is one piece of research going on at the moment in Ethiopia, which is looking at men and women's attitudes to the women on the committees to try and get a sense of this whole area, to try and get a sense of whether they've made a difference, to what extent does it actually help have women committee members in terms of the efficiency of the schemes or not, and to what extent does it actually change women's sense of who they are and what they can do, and community sense of, including men's, what they are and what women can do. So we'll have something from that quite soon. I think the research is finished and it's being written up at the moment. I could share that down the line.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions?
I don't know if I missed it earlier, but I'd be interested to understand a little more about the Women's Experiences Snapshot tool. Is that something that was embedded in your monitoring system? Was it a one-off? Was it an external study? How did you go about that piece?
Helen? Did you hear the question?
So it's something that's evolved over time, and it's something that we developed. We meaning actually initially myself with some of the Ethiopia team, and it came out of the Women's Empowerment Framework, and it came out of the sense that we wanted a simple tool to administer, and it's evolved over time, and we've got variations of it. It was primarily initially a individual woman's response tool, but we're now testing the use of something like that at a focus group discussion level, so with groups of people responding to the questions. It's available on the wiki if you want to see more about it. Or again, if you're interested in a discussion about it, do email me, because it has evolved over time.
Thank you.
Any other questions online or? Okay, I have a question. So I know you all mentioned that the Rwanda program was one of the only ones you found where they kind of started off specifically focused on gender equity within the WASH program. And I don't know that you have an answer for this, but I'm just wondering, what made that happen? Like, what was different about that project that they kind of came at it from that perspective from the get-go? Because it seems pretty uncommon within our programming.
I wish I had the answer, and it's one that, as you mentioned, I'm like, yeah, it would be really interesting to find that out, which I've been making contact with them to find out more about the methodology and, how we can maybe apply that methodology elsewhere. Unfortunately, I don't know. I wonder perhaps if it depended on what else they had in their portfolio. I know there's been some interesting engaging, and Teresa, you'd know better, engaging men and boys work in, was it Burundi?
And in Rwanda.
In Rwanda, okay.
Yeah.
So it could be, they had other initiatives with that influenced this. And that would be my guess as to how that happened. It's a much easier transfer if that type of work is happening in country than a different region, for example. But,
I think an addition on that is that it's not surprising it's come out of Rwanda, given Rwanda's history in a way. That because of the genocide and because of the very high political participation in Rwanda that we have now, it's the country that's got the greatest women's representation in the world. There are more than 50% women MPs in Rwanda. So it seems to me that there's an understanding of, or an interest and an interest in gender issues and the possibility for change there that's at a higher level than in many other countries. And the other thing is, I seem to remember that there was early versions of this that were not very well. The idea was put into the document about addressing this, and it wasn't fleshed out very much. And then there was some iterations with the water team and with some of the other units at the time. We're going back quite a few years to flesh it out and be more specific. So I think the idea of putting it on the agenda came from the Rwanda Care team, and I think because of the context in the wider country. And because once it was there was a need to be clearer about how it would be measured and what it was about. And that's where an iteration process with Care USA also happened, and I think helped.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Anyone online? Any last questions before we wrap up?
I had one clarifying question. I know earlier on in the presentation, you guys had mentioned the gender equitable control of the water services, and you had assigned a score to it. And I remember a list of criteria that were used in measuring this. But I was wondering if each of those criteria were measured equally, or if they were weighted differently, or and I'm wondering if I'm remembering it correctly. So I also want to go back to that slide to check it out.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I think that's one of the first ones, right?
Yeah. So we tended to weight anything that gave explicit attention to women's issues a bit more heavily than the others. So, so for example, that first bullet, we tended to weight a bit more heavily than the other two, because it was, whether rightly or wrongly, part of the rationale behind that was that it was just more rare to find work that really did address gender equity for all the reasons that we discussed. And even more rare to have it not just, talk more generally about, women mentioned that there were reductions in time collected, but that the methodology of the project itself was very deliberate in trying to change women, outcomes for women specifically. So, for example, through, one project had women's leadership associations, and they deliberately set up these groups and trained them on how to do community assessments of wash needs, and also to manage various wash interventions, implementation, and evaluation. So if they were that specific as far as our methodology is geared towards using women, not just from an instrumental standpoint, to manage the Water Plus services, but also because we believe that these women's leadership associations will be beneficial to the women themselves and their communities, that type of methodology we would give that more scores than, methodology that, let's say, worked with community development associations, but did not have a specific gender approach towards those. It was just general community development associations. So let's see about the other two. And then I would say of the remaining two, the third one, whether it empowered people to articulate their Water Plus needs and aspirations, we would also give more weighting to that. We did give more weighting to that, also because it was rare to find approaches where it was about building local governance, building the ability of individuals to sit down, discuss, articulate what their plans, aspirations, and goals were as far as bringing water to their communities or managing whatever water sources they had. We have a well-known project called the Empowers Project, which is about local water governance in the Middle East and North Africa. So that was one such example of, how that kind of approach, which is very much about facilitation and not so much about us directly providing services, how that approach does exist and can be quite powerful, but it's rare, at least in what we surveyed.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So we're out of time. So yeah, thanks again, Helen and Malika, for taking the time to share. And thanks to everyone who signed on online and showed up today. And again, the recording will be on the WIME wiki page. And I'll make sure to also add links to the water wiki page where the snapshot tool is and their other reports and tools are, so everyone can find that from there. So, okay, well, thank you and goodbye.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you.
It's really exciting to see all that you guys have been looking at. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Really great. Thanks so much for taking the time to